Hi, great to be back with you today. Dr. Johnson here. We're still looking at virtue, the benefit, the hidden value and power of virtue. And today is our 22nd installment out of new number. There's 30 now. I had 28 before, but two new special ones will be coming up with, and 29 and 30. But anyway, today's topic is entitled Virtue and the Paradox of Brokenness. Paradox, that's an interesting word. There are few words out there that really capture my attention, mainly because I like the sound of them, but also, what's the meaning? What is a paradox? What is that? Well, the operational definition of a paradox is an apparent contradiction that points up a truth. So how can a contradiction point up a truth? And what does it have to do with virtue and brokenness? Well, let's see. I see paradox in my own life and in the lives of all the patients that God brings into my room, my counseling room. Paradox is everywhere. We just don't see it as much as we could. And really trying to understand paradox is something that can really help us in a lot of ways. I want to give you a little story. Some time ago, I started writing a book on paradox, but I never finished it. And the reason why I didn't finish it, as I'm reading along what I've written, I'm realizing that paradoxically, what I'm writing about paradox is not going to illuminate or elucidate the concept of paradox. It's only going to make it more confusing. So writing the book on paradox became a paradox for me. But when you embrace, and here's really the central point of this session, when you embrace your woundedness, that is your shadows, and your brokenness, which I would call your compulsions, then you are at the very same time that you're embracing your shadows and your compulsions, you're wounded and your brokenness, you are at the same time inviting in the truth, beauty, and goodness of Christ into your life. That's a paradox, you see? So let's go a little deeper. What are we talking about here? Hiding your brokenness, and by the way, brokenness defines our humanity in at least some of the same ways, paradoxically. Hiding your brokenness only binds up your heart, your mind, and your soul. It congests it, so it's not usable the way it could be and should be, hopefully, usable in our lives. So as you sometimes very gradually, while at other times quite suddenly, become aware of and even embrace your own brokenness, paradoxically, you loosen the ropes of the ego protection, all those protection mechanisms you use to cover up your ego that have tied up and frozen your true self for so very long. Are you getting the notion here of this paradox? We have to embrace what's wrong, what's broken about us in order to recognize truly what is truth, beauty, and goodness within us. So recognizing and embracing your shadows and compulsions has now paradoxically rendered you open and free and clean and unburdened. But embracing your brokenness is anything but easy. So why is that? Why is embracing your brokenness? Why is really living up to, or at least owning up to, your own brokenness and woundedness? Why is this so daunting? Well, who wants to show their dirty laundry? Not many of us. No, we're always taught, I was taught certainly, to put your best foot forward. And isn't your best foot supposed to be clean and attractive and intelligent and responsible? It's supposed to be all good. It's supposed to be wonderful about you. We don't like to go hanging out our dirty laundry, so to speak. So what do? To be human means that we are broken. Now that may be dismal for some people to hear, but it's really quite real. Brokenness, therefore, is essential to be a human being. If you didn't have brokenness, you wouldn't be a human being. Paradoxically, your very humanness requires brokenness. Wow, I think that's a dramatic paradox here. To be free, then, and truly happy, you and I and everybody in this world has to enter into and fully embrace our brokenness. So paradoxically, the better you understand and your brokenness and embrace it, the more you're free to be able to become the true self you actually are. There's the paradox. Let's give an example. I have to read this, pardon me, but this is actually about one of my former patients, and don't worry, I have contacted her and she has given me complete freedom to be able to say this. I will not mention her name, of course. Anyway, here's the way it goes. One of my counseling patients carries boatloads of negativity from her formative years. Her mother, chronically overstressed by her children and by her full-time job, slid over into her critical and blaming shadows. My patient became the prime target for her mother's disapproval. Perhaps without realizing it, that she was being caustically critical of her daughter, her mother found two rather ominous and tragic targets. One is my patient was a bit overweight when she was a young girl, and two, she suffered from a reading comprehension problem, which naturally made school for her difficult, unrewarding, unfriendly, and even fearful. She didn't like going to school. It wasn't a positive thing. And on top of that, she was overweight. From a very young age, she struggled to discover some way to please her mother, to find some semblance of affirmation. To compensate for her unfavored status from her mom, my patient became the Cinderella of her household. Very quickly, she learned how to, quote, keep house. She became the housemaid. She did all the cooking, the cleaning, the organizing, etc., all to gain some sort of approval and affirmation from her mom. Yet, the emotional scars from what she interpreted as her mom's disapproving attitude toward her, one that my patient interpreted as, quote, I'm not good enough, has always festered in her heart and pressed her to hide her inner truth, hide it even from herself, well into her adult years. She sees everyone as better than she sees herself. There are the 20 consequences of low self-esteem from my own book, Freedom from Low Self-Esteem. You know what she said to me? She said, you must have written that book expressly for me. Well, I didn't, but certainly she fit the mold. She married, even though she couldn't believe that anyone would want her. She is today a very successful, loving, and even adoring mother. Yet she struggles with all this inner hurt still. Upon arising each day, her first action is to go into the bathroom where she does every day, two destructive things. Number one, she looks at herself in the mirror, and number two, she steps on the scale. Both of these actions reinforce her not good enough brokenness. From each of these, she hears what she calls her, quote, ugly voice screaming at her, you're not good enough. You're fat and you're ugly. The fact is that in reality, number one, she's quite attractive, and number two, she is very smart. But they seem to play no role in her personal self-assessment. The words of self-denigration keep her trapped in her shadows and her compulsions and ensure that she never intentionally will run her personality from her virtue strengths. This not good enough underpinning of her personality is her essential brokenness. She remains locked into this unrealistic view of herself, primarily because she can't embrace her own fundamental paradox, that all humans are, by definition, broken. This isn't a dismal thought. No, it's a fantastically freeing thought. The fact is, We need our shadows and our compulsions so that we can better see and understand our virtue strengths. So I look at her virtue strengths and her shadows and her compulsions. And I'm just going to run through several of them here. I don't need to run all of them, but I think you'll get the message as to how she continues to put herself down. Low self-esteem is part of her, it is her middle name. She seems to be constantly stuck in her own depression. She laments her own presence. It's almost like she has to make excuses for even existing. She judges herself harshly. She is obtuse to her own interior life. She indulges herself in perpetual grieving that she's not good enough. And by consequently, she's indifferent to her own needs. All of this is part of her brokenness. Wow, if this isn't a formula for self-denigration, I don't know what is. But then we look at her compulsions, and she presumes that her ugly inner voice is right. She hides behind an imaginary, humorous front. She's in servitude to her inner, ugly voice. She represses her true self. She's dependent on others to provide any kind of belonging or peace in her heart. But here's the paradox. For her, and really for all of us, healing our brokenness is about moving beyond our shadows and our compulsions by using them to help us define our virtue strengths. I know, this is paradoxical. Shadows and compulsions are like a frame around a beautiful painting, piece of art. Even though the frame itself is useless and maybe even be quite ugly, when it's placed around the painting or the piece of art, the beauty of the entire piece is enhanced. Kind of paradoxical. So here's some fundamental paradoxes, and I'll kind of end with that. I think you're getting the point of what I'm hopefully trying to say here today. And I'll apply it to this patient of mine. Would my patient ever taste the fullness of hope without tasting the sourness of despair or the disappointment of presumption? Probably not. Would she ever see the full beauty of humor without the worry of lamentation and the temptation towards recklessness, which is the compulsion of humor? Would she ever deeply feel the warmth of empathy without first feeling the sting of obtuseness and ingratiating herself? Would she ever experience the animating inner order of self-discipline without experiencing the weakness of self-indulgence or the confinement of self-oppression? And finally, would she ever experience the deep satisfaction of kindness without knowing the pangs of indifference or falling into the pit of codependency? Here is the ultimate paradoxical lesson of life. You must take on your shadows and your compulsions, know them well, use them to your advantage to grow into the spirit of living, not by living in them, that is the shadows and the compulsions, but more by letting them help you define the true and truly magnificent who that you are in the eyes of God. Thank you. See you next time.